Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast that is dedicated to the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm
I'm
Luke.
Sorry about that. I'm Will.
Okay, I can start. Okay. I'll
Fuck
just
it.
take it from the top.
Nice.
Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. I am one of the co-hosts, Kate.
I'm Luke.
God damn it.
Jesus, sorry.
No, I
Might be.
mean, like, All right. I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And Cody can
And
do whatever
today-
he wants with that.
Yeah, that'll be fun for him to edit. And today we are going to be talking about chapters 13 and 14 of Against the Day. We apologize for the sort of unexpected extended hiatus from the show. We've had some difficulties in recording due to some personal circumstances that have come up. And Cody is in the middle of moving from one state to another here in the US. So he is not going to be with us this week, but will hopefully be able to join us for our next recording. But, Luke, I hear you have a summary for us.
That I do. So this next chapter opens with the infotainment that we are now reading the Journal of One Fleetwood Vibe. I believe this is one of the few, if not, I don't think it's the only one, but it's one of the few prose sections written from a first-person perspective in any book by Pynchon. Anyway, so we open with the Vormant's expedition is eating a sumptuous meal, and they begin to hear a singing chorus, and that serves as foreshadowing for the arrival of the Chums of Chance. The Chums warn the expedition about the artificial nature of the nearby mountain peak. Then there's a prolonged description of the various scientific instruments the Chums have with them on their airship. Fleetwood seems somewhat hypnotized by the confusing panoply of wires and tubes and devices. The Chums show Vormance and Fleetwood the view from their camera lucida. The local mountain on attack, when seen through the device, appears to be the unnameable beast that their Russian nemesis previously warned them about. But the expedition and the Chums quickly dismiss the realness of whatever they viewed through the camera lucida, and they set to work freeing it from its icy home. A figure appears out of the north, covered in bearskins, bearing the name Magyarkin. He's a shaman, perhaps capable of bilocation, and he warns the group about the unnameable beast. I prefer the first stirrings of Pugnax's liberating influence over the local Huskies are noticed. The expedition members struggle to fit the unnameable beast into their ship so as to transport it back to civilization. The object seems to change every time it is measured, however. This makes the loading process nearly impossible, so they have to cut the object with torches. The expedition turns around, heading south and parting ways with the Chums of Chance. They make it to port, and the expedition members who supposedly heard the object speak in unknown or ancient languages are sent to the loony bin, though Fleetwood himself admits that the creature must have escaped from containment even before they made port. Fleetwood attempts to make his way back to Washington, D.C., but New York City is in an uproar. There's violence and confusion all over the streets, and seemingly every citizen is trying to make their way out of town. Fleetwood is eventually able to leave, however, and finds himself in the Explorers Club. Him and his fellow colonizers swap stories and bits of news. The one explorer stops the conversation by monologuing about humankind's future evolutions. By the end of the conversation, the talk has turned to the chaos the object wrought upon the port city Fleetwood just arrived from. The next chapter is we're moving backwards in time, and we rejoin the Chums of Chance as they hastily try to overtake the Vormance expedition. As the Chums have seemingly realized that the object, which they also call a visitor, the expedition is carrying southward, is not a meteorite. Next, it is revealed that the Chums are being all but interrogated by their superiors, who have chosen to convene in the Museum of Museumology, outside of which can be seen the racked wasteland brought about by the creature from the north. For some reason, what little remains of the NYC government have chosen this museum as their home base in the aftermath of the visitors' attack. The former low-level bureaucrats discuss the reasons behind the northern creature's attack, then attempt to summarize the facts. Chaos had swept through the city almost instantly once the creature freed itself from the ship it arrived within. This chaos persisted for days, but as a sort of last-ditch attempt at victory, a hologram that is both Jesus and not Jesus is projected every night on top of the cathedral of the Prefiguration. The ways in which the disaster has changed New York City for the worse are then delineated, although there are some positives as well, such as increases in arch building and Dante references. The denizens of the city begin to construct propitiatory structures in order to calm the beast. Many of these are purposely destroyed. We end the chapter with Hunter Penhollow, who's a new character, I believe. Could be wrong, I don't know. I'm pretty sure he's a new character. As he makes his way out of town, having previously gotten lost in a liminal area of the city. He eventually finds other people, all of whom are ready to evacuate, so they journey to the subway and begin their escape by going deeper and deeper underground. Though it soon appears that the city has dug down to meet them, even growing increasingly futuristic as it does so.
All right, thank you. What did we think of these two chapters? And I realized I said them wrong. This is chapters 12 and 13, not 13 and 14.
I really like how these chapters kind of lead into one another. I mean, they're kind of like, a set piece where the chapter 12 kind of foreshadows a lot of what goes on in chapter 13. It took me a few reads to kind of really wrap my head around like how that foreshadowing was working though, because the nature of the beast was pretty unclear to me for a while. And then I kind of was sitting around and I realized that, it's the spirit of the mountain or whatever, and that's almost stated. But for whatever reason, it just took me a while to get there, and one or two rereads. It does kind of remind me of the Godzilla section in Vineland for a few different reasons. I mean, it's a similar kind of set piece in a lot of ways, in terms of the destruction and kind of the surprise of it, and how it kind of comes from nowhere, and then especially the way that it just as I don't believe that these two chapters really have much of a impact on what's to come in the story. I guess that's a bit of a spoiler, but it's kind of a self-contained episode within the larger book in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's interesting to read Pynchon whenever he's writing in first person. That is not something that he does a lot, I believe, and I think he does it pretty well. Especially I like the ending section of chapter 12 in the Explorers Club, especially for a few different reasons. Yeah, these are two really fun, good chapters. There's some really good prose. It's maybe not as good as what's been. Like the prose isn't probably as good as some of the previous sections, but it is up there in terms of good prose so far in this book. Yeah, it's just kind of fun to speculate about like what this creature may have looked like, how it did what it did. There's a few different books it kind of brings up in terms of like other books that play with like spirits of mountain, like the spirit of a mountain or a hill or a tree being taken to another place and then wreaking havoc there and stuff that I can think of. I feel like I've enjoyed all those books like that I've read. And as the Pynchon Wiki goes on at length about, there's a lot of kind of Lovecraft references. It's fun to think about this in terms of it's kind of a post 9/11 look at New York City, I guess.
Yeah. I am glad that at least one of us feels comfortable with the identity of whatever this monster is, because I certainly do not. And
Sure.
ever since I read this section, I've it has sat in the back of my mind, and I have. I'll suffice. It'll suffice to say that I'm just not satisfied with the spirit of the mountain, or any other simple interpretation, personally. But it's just an incredible section. These 3 chapters in a row here. I would like to take this moment to pause it, as I have previously, as I did during Mason and Dixon, that I think that as much as they are compared, I do think that Thomas Pynchon in the 90s did read some of William Vollmann's writing, because between Mason and Dixon and Against the Day, there are a half dozen specific phrases and specific stories of that period of Viking history that really come to the fore. And the use of the nunatop in this chapter is one of those. And I love what Pynchon does with it, because it's so much more creative than I think it would be really easy to leave it as. And like with the Gudrid or whatever characters, whatever person it was, historical personage in Mason and Dixon was centered in that story. It like also worth reading. The Ice Shirt for its different take on this whole issue. I find like this is the most intense horror, as far as I'm aware, that Pynchon has ever written. And
Yeah, I can't think of anything else that would rival this.
The only thing I can think of is the nose job in V.
Oh, sure.
But that's very different.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that sums up my feelings. It's a lot, and I find it really enchanting and really disturbing. And that's what good horror should do, right?
Yeah, I believe so. I would essentially agree with both of you in its entirety. I don't know if I have a solid grasp on what the creature is either, and I think that that's certainly purposeful. I think that it can be interpreted any number of ways, and I think that that's what makes part of this so interesting. It's also what lends this set of chapters so closely to something like a Lovecraft, where like so much of Lovecraft's horror is based in this idea that there is some sort of unexplainable horror. Then if you see it, you like lose your mind or something happens to you. This kind of indescribable horror, though, that has a implication, I guess is the way that I would put it, in the sense that, like, yes, you don't know exactly what this thing is that's in front of you, but it does carry the implication, at least in Lovecraft's fiction for the most part, that like you are entirely insignificant in the face of the cosmos, or in the face of like what is possible, or the reality of infinity, things like that. I think that Pynchon does a very similar thing here. It is also kind of neat to see what an epistolary novel written by Pynchon might look like. I enjoy the kind of pastiche of that first of these two chapters, and then the way that it kind of flips perspectives from the person writing the history, so to speak, or writing the story, to kind of what things actually look like. I also think is a really neat thing that he plays with there. And both of these chapters are super effective. And I would agree that it's probably the most effective horror he's ever written. Other than I suppose the nose job in V would count. And yeah, it's also a good summation of kind of this first arc of the book, at least in my perspective. We've talked a lot about sort of the death of the frontier and the dying of kind of that like magical interior world, and all of the things that came with a pre-modern society a lot over the course of this show and this season in particular. But this is really where not just that thread about like the Chums heading towards the Vormance expedition is wrapped up, but it's also sort of a closing out of that old world, so to speak, and this birth of the new one. And I think it's really, really compelling the way that he does that over a couple of different sort of motifs or thematic ideas throughout the two chapters. And I think it's just very, very well done, and really, really enjoyable to read. And several times, as I do often when we're preparing for episodes of this show, I kind of just stop and go, "Wow, this guy is like a genius." And there's not really anyone else who writes like him at all.
Yeah, I mean the best part of this section, which I'm lumping in the previous chapter, but these two in particular, is that sense of ineffability that isn't couched directly in the way that Lovecraft, did in an impressive way in his own right, but Pynchon is really using that ambiguity that makes his books hard to read into an actual device of horror, which is an interesting.
Yeah. Agreed. So, as previously mentioned, chapter 12 opens in an epistolary format, which would have been very popular literature for the time frame that this is taking place in. We are at the sort of the end of the 1800s here, based upon some of the context clues of different historical things that are referred to as happening. 1898 1899 is most likely where a lot of this is taking place. This book has some, anachronisms in it, or maybe some like back and forth between time frames, because some of that stuff from the labor wars and all of that doesn't take place in the same time. It takes a little bit, further into the future. So, but that's kind of where we're centering in over these two chapters, and we get an idea that the Vormans expedition is heading north. We don't know specifically what they were intending to do necessarily, but the Chums of Chance do come across them, and we are greeted by Chick Counterfly suddenly being old enough to grow a beard, and he is also wearing a pair of nickel prism glasses, which would in effect be 3D glasses, is what they would be. A nickel prism is used. It uses basically the same material that we've talked about many times, that Iceland spar type of optical calcite, in order to analyze like polarized light, is basically what they're used for, based upon the research that I was able to find. But if you were to wear lenses of it, it would in effect render you as wearing a pair of 3D glasses. And he brings the members of the Vormans expedition aboard the Inconvenience. And as they kind of go through, there's a lot of different technology alluded to and brought up in here, which we'll get into some of it. But before they start going into sort of the hold of the ship, they start talking about the idea that there is this Nunatak, a mountain, basically is somewhere where they are. Do you want to kind of summarize or give a description of what a Nunatak is, Will?
Yeah. So I was hoping to have been able to identify exactly the definition that William Volman gives in the Ice Shirt, just because of the fact that he is a journalist and he did interview Greenlandic people to talk about their language and their view of history. But I can't find the exact phrasing of any of his definitions in the Ice Shirt. So I'm just going to have to spitball it. My impression that he gave was not dissimilar from the Land Connect one, but more specifically, kind of the idea of this is an abutment. It's not a terribly deep concept, but just the idea that in the same way that we use northeast, south, and west as people who live in relatively temperate latitudes, but up north, you don't use those. You use inland, outland, inland, and coast. And if you live in a world that is full of snow, every year it's gonna look a little different, if not every week. So Nunataks are the primary, or were the primary way of navigation for those people who made the North their home.
Yeah. And so in this case, the Vormans expedition is kind of using what they assume to be a Nunatak as their command post, is what Chick Counterfly refers to it as. But he does also say, have any of you considered the idea that this is an artificial structure because it's far too sort of uniform in its design, or far too like regular in its shape? And so they basically say like, oh yeah, and so I bet you can see right down to the bottom of it, can't you? And then Chick Counterfly basically says, well, yeah, actually you can, like, and let me show you. And so he brings them down into the hold of the Inconvenience, and we get a sense that perhaps the Inconvenience is also doing some weird stuff with its size. It might be bigger on the inside, or it at the very least doesn't look like from the outside it should have as much space as it does on the inside. And there are a number of different things that are mentioned here. There's Magnanin resistance boxes, Tesla coils, Leclanche cells, and solenoidal magnets. Magnanin resistance boxes are something that you can use to check for the power of resistance of something. It uses manganese for that. Tesla coils we've talked about at length. The Leclanche cells are the first batteries that were ever made, or the first like patented batteries as we kind of understand their concept now. And solenoidal magnets are used to measure sort of magnetic fields, or can be used for that. So they've in the time since we've last been with them, they have not just taken the Tesla device on board, but they have filled the absolute, wall to wall nature of the inner hull of the vessel with all of this different scientific equipment that is used specifically for measuring different rays, different waveforms, all of this sort of scientific stuff that has been kind of talked about at length over the course of the early portions of the book. And what he also shows them is a Paulson's telegraphone, which is one of the very first recording devices that was ever patented. It didn't quite work out because the recording playback was really, really quiet and wasn't particularly sort of reliable. We also do get a back and forth conversation here about calls. That there is if a child is born with a human call, which, for lack of a better, I guess, and maybe if one of you has a better way to describe this, it is more or less that sometimes when a human being is born, just like other animals, there is sort of this leftover membrane around their head from being in the womb. That's my understanding of it. Is that how you guys understand what that is as well?
Yeah, it's the wonderful thing that keeps your yolk from getting all over your toast, but on humans.
Yeah. And so if a baby is born with that still sort of on them, then that is typically heralded as like a big deal. Like maybe this child is going to have some sort of second sight to another realm. And then they say that a ship that is veiled also is sort of impervious to sinking. And that's a very real naval superstition. And then, of course, we get kind of the gross twist on this from a money perspective versus the spiritual perspective with Fleetwood Vibe saying, well, you can actually just buy one of those. Like you nowadays, if you're so inclined, you're able to obtain one. We then get a reference to a camera lucida, which is quite an interesting device. This is another use for sort of prisms and refracting light that I had never heard of until reading this, but basically, as I understand it, what you could use this for, if you were sort of an artist or someone who was looking to trace something, is you could have it project an image onto a lens that would then refract down onto the piece of paper on the table. And so you could see both what you were drawing as well as what you were basically superimposing on it without actually putting it on the sheet of paper, if I understand it correctly. Maybe I'm not explaining that in the most, comprehensive way. But basically, you would see the image you're trying to trace or draw, but it wouldn't actually be overlaying the paper, but you could also see what it is that you were doing with your hand and that pencil or pen you were holding. I'm not exactly sure what these would have been used for in practice necessarily at the time, but that is certainly what the counterfly uses in order to kind of reveal the true nature of the mountain. And the true nature of the mountain is that it is coded in warnings of a strange language that they cannot speak, but that they interpret the words as being warnings of some kind, or some sort of message to stay away or to leave this place alone, so to speak. And then when they sort of zoom in further, so to speak, that's where we get the first sort of description of whatever this beast is. Does someone want to read the paragraph starting with "more like due diligence"?
More like due diligence, by Dr. Counterfly, and a respect for probability. He gestured toward the image transmitted by the prisms of the instrument that had been growing steadily clearer, like a fateful dawn none await with any eagerness. Too soon we discovered that we could not look away. Though details were still difficult to make out, the figure appeared to recline on its side an odalisque of snows, though to what pleasures given posed a question far too dangerous, with as little agreement among us as to its facial features, some describing them as mongoloid, others as serpent-like. Its eyes, for the most part, if eyes be what they were, remained open, its gaze as yet undirected, though we were bound in a common terror of that moment at which it might become aware of our interest and smoothly pivot its awful head to stare us full in the face.
So what do we think about this creature? There are a lot of different sort of literary things that you can bring up in allusion to what they're sort of describing. There are some even in the paragraph. Of course, in Odalisque was a type of woman who often was serving in a harem in a sort of a Turkish like royal sense, and oftentimes they were painted as reclining. So that's of course where that reference is coming from. But also, there's the crossover with At the Mountains of Madness from H.P. Lovecraft, where there's a creature or creatures in the ice, even though that's the Antarctic rather than Arctic. There is like the thing from another world, or the thing where there is an alien that is frozen in ice, and that when thawed kills everybody at the research base. There is the Pinch on Wiki brings up Alien versus Predator, which is not something that I would have expected to ever see referenced on that website, but that technically is also a point of allusion here. There is the obvious sort of big one in that the ninth circle of hell in Dante is frozen over, and that is also where Lucifer resides. There's a lot of different kind of allusions there. There's also some references within the Pinch on Wiki to stuff in Hindu lore and mythology. What do we think of the nature of the beast? We don't necessarily need to give like exact description, metaphysical or otherwise, because that is a bit hard to do. But this is a pretty big point, not just in this chapter, but this section we're going through.
I do think it's interesting that it's portrayed as, I mean, from the odorless thing, that you can infer that it's just kind of sitting there on its side, laying there on its side, either ignoring the expedition and the chums, or I don't know. It seems very disinterested, I guess is one way to put it. I mean, it's pretty clear, at least from the next chapter, that it's frozen. That could explain some of the lack of movement and stuff. Obviously, I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't. It is kind of strange to me that if it is the spirit of the mountain or whatever, that it has a physical form and stuff. And later in this chapter and later in chapter 13, especially in chapter 13, it's never described physically. It's just the effects it has on the city are described, and the people of the city. That's what's described. It's never portrayed as like walking around, knocking down buildings or anything. It's just all this crazy stuff starts happening. So it almost doesn't even need to have a physical form, I guess, in some ways in that chapter, or it doesn't seem to have a physical form in that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
I find the haunting aspect of at least this depiction of it to be that I took its description as an odalisque of the snows, as being more like it's like bashful, which is horrible. Especially with the later talk about not understanding and trying to play with us, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Just a real impression of like I mean, not to get too literally abstract, but like it feels like it's supposed to be the epitome of the alluring other in a lot of ways, because like there's the fact that yes, it's described as serpent-like, and it's frozen under ice, much like Satan. But it's also described as mongoloid, which has a lot of connotations. We don't have time to get. We just can't get through all of them, and we don't want to either. But like, there's a pretty universally it implies otherness from a social standpoint. And the way I see it is that kind of fusion of Satan and an alien, like that this point, 1898, 1899, is kind of like the crossing point where people go from thinking that, oh, it's Satan, it's a demon, to, oh, it's aliens, at least in the way that Pynchon is framing it.
Sure. So from there, they sort of decide to completely ignore any of the kind of, hey, maybe leave this thing alone, or hey, maybe leave this whole area alone, or hey, there's been a danger zone declared for hundreds of miles around. They ignore all of that the Chums of Chance tried to explain to them, and they decide to go for it anyway. And they start to dig into the mountain to extract this creature, this being, whatever word you'd want to use for it. And some things start to go a little bit strange from that point. At this point, they are digging into the ground, what they foolishly quote, continue to call the Nunatak, to meet their destiny. And at some points, the Eskimos that they were with seemed eager to speed up what they were doing. And then it is later revealed that maybe that isn't the case. Maybe that's just an affect, because occasionally they are caught sort of whispering to themselves silently about something. But something seems to be amiss with how they are viewing what is now going on. And then at a certain point, they start to just kind of ignore the signs that things are not quite right. Eventually, animals stop to watch them. The dogs start behaving strangely. They bark at things that they shouldn't bark at, or don't bark when they should be. And they start to kind of self-rationalize what they're engaging in by saying things like, even the weather is cooperating. Glad we've all got contracts. Well, vibes will sell it, whatever it is, the minute they see it. And I think this is, some of those quotes are pretty effective to kind of the thematic intent of what a lot of what Pynchon is building towards in my mind. In that, like, they are literally extracting something evil from the ground. They are engaging in an awakening of something evil in general. But they are trying to kind of soothe the nature of what they're doing by saying, well, at least we're getting paid, or like, at least this is going to generate money of some kind, which you could very easily sort of extrapolate out to get to corporations that dump stuff into water supplies, or corporations that sell military contracts and weapons to other nations who may not be using them for benevolent purposes, and see kind of this same parallel of, like, capitalism sometimes will make you do really awful things, but there's always the money. So it's some clever stuff that Pynchon is already doing as he begins this narrative. And then eventually, this is where we get the creature from the north. Mr. Hastings Throyle calls out to it in a native tongue and refers to him as old. Doesn't even know how to pronounce that name. Magaikan?
Yeah, I pronounced it Magyarkan.
Yeah, I was
Magyarkan.
assuming that or Magyakon. Something in that.
Yeah.
And so he's somehow approached them on foot, and this is where we get this description of the possibility of bilocation, or somehow being in two places at once. And when he shows up, they are starting to speak to him about sled dogs and all sorts of sort of strangeness in Arctic kind of either exploration or sort of madness that happens from ships running aground, things like that. And then he just kind of like disappears. What do we think of this interaction between this sort of bilocating stranger and the Vormance folks?
I make little of it, except the fact that it clearly this guy's come a long way. He's, it might be astral projection, but he still had to walk most of the way across the Arctic region to deliver this warning. But beyond that, like, from a classical story structure standpoint, you've got these people descending from on high who look like the people who are doing the expedition, telling them in their language, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, it's dangerous. And they get ignored. And then, a few days later, this stranger to them, who's from outside of their realm of society, comes and tells them in his language, this is this is not a good idea. You should stop doing it. And then, there's one more kind of brushed over in the narrative, but on the next page, it talks about how they had to, bring out the plasma cutters to get this thing into the hold. And in a sense, that's third warning. Don't do this. And so this is that central one.
I think it's interesting to read the guy's main monologue is from the perspective of somebody being colonized. Like a lot of that paragraph can be, like could have been said by somebody whose land was just taken over by Europeans in any number of places at any number of times in the history of humankind. So I think that's interesting. Where it seems like he's warning the expedition about the creature, but it's also he seems to be kind of relating the creature to colonizers in a way. Or I think that Pynchon at least wants that subtext to be in there where you can read that paragraph and you could transpose it onto a bunch of different situations and a bunch of different times in history. It also seems to kind of, the they seems a little bit nebulous as to who that guy is referring to in general. You can interpret it as like, the spirits of the land, like the gods of the land. The they in that paragraph can be a few different people, which is interesting to think about. Yeah, and the fact that he comes from the north is obviously important. Having he would have presumably come pretty close to the North Pole if he came from Siberia, and that also kind of I feel like there's probably been. It's obviously impossible to prove or anything, but at some point in human history, like somebody came pretty close to the North Pole, like closer than Europeans did, maybe at this time. I forget when exactly we achieved the North Pole and all of that. I think you get what I'm saying, though. Like Native people, like a lot of times, white people are said to have discovered things that where Native people had already been living there for a long time and things like that. So like the Northern Passage, the passage between Siberia and North America, was like viewed as impossible by white people. But then here's this guy just walking it on foot. He's not obviously bilocating, but it's possible that he is. I'm not necessarily sure of that. That could just be another instance of othering the native and stuff, or like presuming that the native is doing some like fancy stuff when in fact the native, just walked across the ice and warned them perhaps, or just because he was passing by, he warned them. That small section is actually really fun to think about in terms of relation to like the themes that Pynchon plays with.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think you're absolutely onto something too with your sort of perspective from the colonized perspective, the answer that you gave there, because what he actually says here, and I guess it might be worth it to actually just sort of read it, where it says, "They may not wish to harm us, they may even in some way love us, but they have no more choice than your own sled dogs, in the terrible to them empty land upon which they have chosen to trespass, where humans are the only source of food. We are allowed to live and work until we fall from exhaustion, but they are suffering as much as we. Their voices will be gentle. They will administer the pain only when they must. And when they bring out the weapons, objects we've never seen before, we stare wordless as dogs. We don't recognize them. Perhaps we think they are toys or something else to amuse us." He fell silent, sat, and smoked, and presently slept. Sometimes after midnight, we rose and walked away into the Arctic emptiness. Or he rose and walked away into the Arctic emptiness. The reason I say that relates pretty heavily to colonialism is in the actual Explorers Club later, more or less this exact monologue is delivered by other people who are in the club with Fleetwood Vibe, where they talk about whether or not there is something in the same way that the white Europeans are colonizing the sort of black and brown people of the global south, and that they really have no kind of recourse. So too is the Arctic explorer that they're talking about, whose name escapes me at the moment, who was feeding his dogs one after another to preserve them until he could make a pretty close journey to the North Pole. And then one of those other people in the Explorers Club posits, maybe there's something greater than humanity in total that would view us the same way that explorer does the dogs. And then that whole section is related back to capitalism because it starts with the discussion of corporations being given the same status as human beings in the U.S. federal court system. So certainly this is like bundled in with all of that, right? So I think you're absolutely right on the money there. But it is also setting up that later work that Pynchon is going to do at the end of this chapter, and then largely into the next chapter.
Yeah, and I'd like to further expound on this. I suppose basically, growing up in a post X-Files world, this is just how UFO believers talk about aliens.
Mm-hmm.
Like these are the choices of words they use. This is how people who swear they've been abducted or swear that abductions are happening X, Y, or Z way. This is how they, and it's very, yeah, it all ties together somehow, huh?
I think only Pynchon, if we're talking already about most Pynchon parts of the chapter, could unite like UFO Mooney words with like the expansion of capitalism, with sort of the colonism of the global south, with Arctic expedition, with sort of metaphysical science, all in like one knot of a story. It's pretty impressive. I also want to make special attention here to a phrase used where Throyle mentions, for us, it's simple ability to see into the future based on our linear way of regarding time. A simple straight line from the past through present into the future. Christian time, as you might say. But shamans see it differently. Their notion of time is spread out not in a single dimension, but over many, which all exist in a single timeless instant. I will unite all of the stuff that I'll make random mentions of later, hopefully, if I'm not totally off my rocker, but this is an important concept, at least to me, in my understanding of these chapters. And that Christian time, this concept of linear time that he is articulating, was first posited by Saint Augustine in Confessions. And if I may stand on my like former theologian soapbox, even if you're not a Christian, Confessions and the City of God are both like pretty good reads to just kind of understand like the philosophy of the Christian religion and where a lot of the concepts that underpin Christian sort of thought, especially in the kind of foundational eras, because there really hasn't been much innovation in Christian thought since like the Great Church era and like right after the Great Schism. If you're looking to understand kind of the foundational principles of a lot of that thinking and how that led out to different schisms or sects or denominations of Christianity, he is absolutely one of the people that I would recommend reading. And also Confessions just is kind of, there are parts of it that are just very good statements on the human condition, even decoupled from like a prayer to God. But in that, Augustine articulates that he sees time as linear from when it began to the end of days. And when the end of days come, when Jesus returns and all of the crazy shit that happens in Revelation happens, that's when like the timeline stops. And so what he posits is that as a reality of that we're constantly moving towards that point, then it should be possible for God to understand who is going to be saved and who isn't. And so that's where you get the doctrine of predestination from. And the Catholic Church, who Augustine was a member of and is still venerated by, would later completely jettison that doctrine of predestination. But it would be picked up by John Calvin during the Protestant Reformation. And then a lot of the theology that he articulated seeing within the Bible would have that kind of baked into it. And that's obviously something that shows up in a lot of Pynchon's books from the perspective of who the preterite are or who the elect are. This is all stuff that kind of is foundational within those works of Augustine and within this concept of linear time. So just something to take note of as we continue on. We do also get a great little aside that they started watching the dogs more closely and that Pugnax has actually stuck around even as the inconvenience has left, and that he has maybe organized the dogs into a labor union, which I think is just a lovely bit of humor for him to throw in there. And then we get to, as Will mentioned, kind of the third warning where they do excavate this thing out of the ground, but when they try to get it onto the boat, they can't. And every time they measure it, it is different dimensions. Again, playing with weird spaces and how things exist within space and time. And so what they do is they get the plasma cutters out and they just cut a hole large enough in the boat for the thing to go on. Which, I mean, if you're in this deep, I guess, why not just keep going? But I would like to think that if the roles were reversed and I was finding myself cutting open sides of a boat or widening the entrance of the hull of the boat that I was on just to get this thing on that I had been warned about several times, I'd like to think I would be smart enough to leave it alone at that point. And so at this point, they are headed back to the United States. There is a really great paragraph that I highlighted and wrote, very Lovecraftian here. Does someone want to read on 144? That paragraph starts, which of us was willing to turn?
Which of us was willing to turn, to look the future in the face, to mutiny if necessary, and oblige the captain to put about, or turn the thing to where we had found it? The last of our mean innocence tolled away ship's bell after bell. Even if we could not predict in detail what was about to happen, there could have been no one among us, not even the most literal-minded, who did not feel that something down there below our feet, below the waterline where it lay patient and thawing, was terribly and soon to be more terribly amiss.
Yeah, just that concept of like a group of sailors aboard a boat with something evil in the hold slowly melting is just, I mean, it's like a perfect mixture of both Lovecraft and like Edgar Allan Poe. Just really, really effective horror in my mind. From there, they arrive back at the harbor, and we get some descriptions of all of the kind of different commerce that is involved, and kind of process that is involved with bringing in cargo between all of the bills of lading and the port authorities and the whole nine yards. And we get a interesting description here that the object is imperfectly contained, and that somehow a portion of it, as I understand this paragraph, has already left the object, so to speak. It is already at large, as the text puts it. And this is where things just sort of go insane. Suddenly on the port, we hear, or several people hear it speak, where it hisses, quote, a serpent vengeful and relentless, people raved. And then they say, the man-shaped light shall not deliver you, is something that they heard it declare. And that flames were always your destiny. What is it that we think about? The description of what is missing when they arrive, if you have any thoughts on that. And then also what it says or telepathically communicates to some people that will then end up in a state mental hospital.
What I think is going on in terms of it being improperly contained as they, arrive. I don't read it so much as it having escaped, I guess, but more that there was that it is not an entity. It is not a material object in any way. Again, sure to infuriate some people, but going back to my theory of the Chums of Chance as being unreal in the reality of this book.
Mhm.
That this is what it that is also what this is. That it is a meteorite, and it is just a funky looking meteorite that looks like space. And also, it is a newly discovered field that's not fully calculated. It
Sure.
also, yeah, it is these non-material things on top of it. It is this. It is the voice. It is the ice itself in some ways, maybe, or the limitations of the world in another way.
Uh-huh.
I'm still kind of trying to think it over. I don't necessarily have any specific thoughts. I mean, it is interesting that the people that it seems to talk to are taken to the loony bin. Just because, I mean, maybe it's just the way like the media I've consumed growing up and stuff. But like there's a lot of different shots in movies I can think of where like there's like like the camera's like zooming in on like a chalice and like there's always like voices in the background and stuff. I think you get what I'm saying with that. And like so I think that's interesting. When the man shaped light shall not deliver you, allegedly declared, is definitely foreshadowing for the semi Jesus hologram in the next chapter, which is interesting to think about, even though that man-shaped light in the next chapter does. I mean, I think it's after the creature is done with its destruction that hologram is projected. Well, it's not clear, and it does seem to be taken. I mean, it's I don't. It does seem to, in some ways, either signify that the destruction is over, or it seems to be kind of like some type of way to ward away the spirit, the demon, or whatever. So, I mean, that may not necessarily be factually true, and that it may actually deliver them, the city, the citizens of the city. Well, the whole flames are always your destiny, my children, is definitely what happens pretty quickly after they arrive. As for, I mean, the whole thing about it, like having already like left its containment. I mean, there's already signs that it's exerting, exerting its control over reality or its forces upon reality before that. That shouldn't be that confusing or that that's I mean it should be maybe confusing, but it shouldn't be surprising
Hmm.
that it's possibly already broken containment.
Yeah, and this is where I guess and this where kind of my overarching theory of the two chapters starts to come into to place where, and this may just be like a surface level reading of what's going on, and as someone who hasn't read it before, like totally open to that concept. But to me, it seems like this beast beneath the mountain, or this thing, or this entity, or whatever word you would want to use for it, um, from a metaphorical perspective, sort of represents capitalism and the dawn of the industrialized world and the kind of new world and all of that. And so the word to me, or the words that Pynchon uses that say already at large, goes to speak that like when they arrive at the port, they're arriving in a place where all of that industry and all of that capitalism and all of that representation of the new world is already there. And so it kind of, for lack of a better description that I can come up with, joins in with it already. It kind of is already there. That field, or that kind of alternate reality that overlays the old, is already there and it just joins into it. But it is sort of an animating force of the type of evil that is, and so it instantly kind of breaks open a new era or a new opening within the kind of um, symbolic understanding of that moving forward into history, or moving forward into industrialism, or however you'd want to describe it. And so it's already there. But it's reached a point where it's genuinely sort of evil, or it's genuinely starting to eat human beings, as those dual monologues start to talk about that there will be this force greater than humanity that consumes humanity. Um, and so that is why people start to literally go insane. That, like, confronted with that reality of where all of this is going, makes them go crazy. Um, and so that's kind of what I make of that. I do think that the figure of light is foreshadowing what happens in the next chapter, as far as what the 3D sort of hologram they project. but I do think that it has more to say about what religion is in a new industrialized modern world than anything else, which is going to be easier to talk about at that point. Do we have any other thoughts on either my crazy rambling or anything else to do with these two sections?
I've got a couple of just essentially notes to add on. So the man-shaped light phrase is taken by most people who are sharing their thoughts about this book online as the light that is formed into something which has a shape similar to a person. And I think that that's an overly narrow interpretation. It also can mean the light that is shaped for man, as in that which mankind can conceive of as light, as well as the light which is projected by mankind. And those kind of, I think, tie very, very in a very, very long metaphorical sense into your interpretation, Kate. Also, just the fact that this thing was coded in warnings which were described as snake-like, and some of the people report hearing hisses, and the snake in the Garden of Eden is a snake.
Right.
And finally, the last thought is just the idea that Satan is the light bringer, and Satan is also, in terms of like how in like comparative mythology, Satan is contrasted with Prometheus, who is the light bringer of ancient Greek myth. And these in both cases they represent knowledge and technology, but in both cases they're also seen as incredibly different in terms of moral value. And
Yeah,
just that,
very true.
yeah, that the idea that maybe Pynchon is grabbing from all of these traditions, whether it's Hinduism with their treatment of Agni, or Zoroastrianism with their more intense treatment of fire, or it's Jewish myth that talks about what was then what was thousands of years later called the light bringer Lucifer, um, brings technology, or Prometheus in the Greek fountain. Just all of those things combined together in this little section.
Yeah, and if you're looking for more biblical allusions in Revelation, it is also described after the archangel Michael defeats Lucifer, that he is cast down to the earth and is referred to as the great serpent. And then if you want to go even further, you could talk about Jormungandr in Norse mythology and lore as also the great serpent that choked the world. It's all over the place, as you're talking about from a multi-traditional perspective. But it all kind of is shaped in a similar way anyway.
Yeah, at least it's tortured into alignment.
That's true. After this sort of initial kind of explosion of psychic energy, I guess is the way that I'll describe it, happens, and people are taken off to the loony bin. We learn that Fleetwood Vibe is specifically reporting to somebody in Washington, so there's a governmental involvement in this whole expedition. But as he's trying to get out of the city, he is constantly finding it difficult to penetrate through all the lines of people trying to escape, the general hysteria, and just the way things are tending to go. People are running the streets like wild. The evening edition is full of exclamatory headlines. And then finally he gets on an outbound train and waits in line as gunfire continues intermittently. And then it shows that not only is he going to be late to where he's trying to go, but obviously there is a double meaning there in that humanity is too late now to turn back the clock as well. So then, yeah, we open up at the Explorers Club, and then there's a whole fight in the comments on the Pynchon Wiki of what it means by the less fashionable one, because the timelines won't work out on how some of those things are built, or when they were built, rather. I think that maybe what Pynchon is saying is that it is less fashionable in the sense that it is another thing called the Explorers Club that isn't full of all the famous people, like the one you would know in history is how I kind of take that sentence, because certainly the stuff they're talking about in here is probably more direct and to the point, especially in the white man's view of the colonial projects and thusly like corporations and all of that, than they probably would have been talking about in the Historical Explorers Club. We get a reference here in the early portions of the conversation to a Dr. Jim, and since then it's been all Queer Street, and that there should be war any moment. This is an interesting bit of history that they're making a reference to. This is a reference to the Jameson raid, which would eventually lead to the Second Boer War. To give a brief overview of what he's describing here, this was an attempted coup by the British government to try and stoke an uprising in the Boer Republic of South Africa, which was at that point known as the Transvaal. Their goal was to try and incite the white expats that had moved to the Transvaal during a gold rush in these incredibly lucrative mines there, so that they could eventually seize that territory from the non-white population and basically just make it into a colony of Britain. At the time, as my understanding of it goes, there was a colony there. It was the Cape Colony, but then there was also still a portion of South Africa that was governed by the Boer, and that's that Transvaal area. But that didn't stop white expats from coming into the Transvaal specifically to try and make money and to kind of hit it rich in these mines that they had. So there was about 500 British South Africa police that went into the territory from Rhodesia, which is modern day Zimbabwe, and their goal was to try and recruit supporters and kind of build a standing army with which to revolt, take control of the mines, and then thusly take control of the government. This didn't work. This was a massive failure and was considered a huge embarrassment. It led to the ousting of the governor of the Cape Colony, and it only led to intensified tensions between the two people groups and between the two territories of land, which would eventually escalate into the Second Boer War in 1899. And that, which is just like kind of a random side piece of history, is sort of how we got Winston Churchill later on. He was down there. He wrote a book about it. It made him pretty famous early on in his career, and eventually we know how that kind of catapulted him towards the prime ministership. But that is the sort of queer war any minute sort of environment that's being described. We then go from that early conversation to eventually this reference of Nansen's plan on his final northward journey. This is a reference to an explorer who is called I don't want to butcher this guy's name, Fridtjof Wedel Jarlsberg Nansen. He was a Norwegian explorer who was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize eventually in 1922 when he was the commissioner of the League of Nations. But prior to that, he was an Arctic explorer. He deliberately allowed a ship to drift off course to go north, where it got stuck in pack ice for over a year. And he was trying to use that as a time to cross the Arctic. And then eventually he did discover the polar basin. And then on another journey, the one that they're talking about here, he did try to sort of push for the pole on foot. And as part of that, he was feeding the dogs to each other, at least as far as what is articulated here. In at least some of the published history, a lot of what he survived on was walrus blubber and polar bear meat. So I wasn't able to find anything to corroborate that. But the point they're making is certainly this kind of higher ordered being is causing a lower ordered being to act against its own self-interest, against its own sort of will, in order to continue advancing the desires of the higher ordered being. And so this then goes into that conversation of how colonial powers do the same thing to the colonized, but then is there something that is going to be greater than even we as the colonizer, who is going to cause us to feed on each other, us to act against our own self-interest, and to kind of do the exact same thing. And there's a line in here about, let's see, what is it? Maybe it'll be some compound organism, the American corporation, for instance, in which even the Supreme Court has recognized legal personhood. This is a reference to Santa Clara County versus the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. It was basically a case where Santa Clara County was giving tax breaks to individual landholders and railroad owners, and was not giving the same tax breaks to corporations. And the Supreme Court of the United States at the time basically said that a corporation is a person, and so therefore they also have to be given those same tax breaks. You cannot discriminate between the two. And then that has led into a number of other cases that have had escalating sort of implications for social relationships between employers and employees and like customers within the United States over and over and over again, especially in more recent history. And so it is this point where he kind of expands on this topic that yes, like that higher ordered being for humans does exist, and it is the corporation, and it is capitalism, and it is those structures that are being built and are continuing to expand the further we kind of modernize. And we get this kind of grand wrap up of all of these ideas over the course of the chapter, with Fleetwood Vibe understanding that this is all about what he brought home from the North. And it says literally here, it was understood at some point by all the company that they were speaking of the unfortunate events to the North, the bad dream I still try to wake from, the great city brought to sorrow and ruin. And so this is where you kind of end up with that interpretation from Pynchon that this force, this sort of destruction that lays waste to New York that we're about to read about, but will eventually eat everything. It is the corporation. It is the entire world that concept represents. Any additional thoughts on this sort of conversation? It's super brief and super to the point for Pynchon, which I find interesting. It's not very often that I think he gives you the interpretation directly on the page, which should go to show that he finds this to be very important to understanding not just what comes next, but probably the whole book.
All I want to add on to all of that is the just to do some connections between this and other book mentions.
Absolutely.
You have a general of some sort, I don't know, talking about how it's too white and too mathematical in the polar regions for civilized evil to inhabit, which is really kind of the inverse of what Gabriel Ice was on about throughout a bunch of poems in Bleeding Edge.
True.
The war, basically, the Boer War is kind of a through line to Pynchon's other two biggest books, in the form of the Cape Colony that Mason and Dixon visited in Mason and Dixon was not the British Cape Colony. It was the colony which the Boers, which then the population of which turned into the population that we now know as the in that 200-year gap, the Dutch East India Company turned over, basically, and all of the people who had gone off to live on homesteads kept living in the Vaal, and the British came back down and pushed them further out. But then the the way that the Boer War culminated was in basically a very, very small scope genocide against the Boers, which has been in contemporary history framed as basically the component of the Holocaust that was missing from the Herero genocide, which Pynchon talked so much about in V and Gravity's Rainbow. That the camp that the Boer War, the Second Boer War, was basically the first time that a European country had intentionally funneled a people group into camps for the purpose of eventual extinction, rather than any long-term plan. And what was the last thing? Was there a last thing? There might not have been a last thing. That might be it. One just something to highlight about this chapter is that there's an exchange that this larger conversation centers on, where basically Fleetwood Vibe had killed a coolie, as it's written, when he was down in the Kruger, whatever they called it, the camps, not the camps, the settlement, I guess, colony kind of thing, and I'm just going to read it. I say, Wood, isn't this a story about you out there dispatching a coolie or something with a wrought? He was looking at me strangely, I said. It is as far as I've ever gone with that story. How's that, Wood? Strangely? What's that? Well, I didn't exactly ask him what it meant, did I? He was Chinese. And I think that it's important to look at the previous section talking about the way that the Eskimos behaved through that lens of this is our viewpoint, is someone who kills a worker because he made a face, and he's one who we should take at their word about the Eskimos rushing and secretly whispering and fleeing before the real evil gets there.
Mm-hmm.
And in line with the allusions to Orientalism and otherness in general throughout the chapter, I think it's salient.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so it brings us to the end of this chapter and into the next chapter, in which the frame of reference is going to be kind of switched. We leave the epistolary novel and instead we go back to the third person, and now we get to see what the as it says, sorrow and ruin is that is brought upon the great city. All right, so chapter opens up with again change in perspective to the members of the Inconvenience pressing southward, quote, using as much fuel as they dared, jettisoning all the weight they could afford to in a desperate attempt to reach the city before the steamer. Etienne Louis Malie. I cannot help but wonder what is to become of these unfortunate events. Rooted chick counterfly. So at this point, we are now given the outside sort of perspective. So even though they have ignored their warnings, even though they've loaded what was inside the mountain onto their ship, they have still decided that it is their imperative to try and stop this from happening. So if they can't stop the members of the expedition from taking what's in the mountain, they may as well warn the city what is sort of about to befall it. And we here learn that the members of the Vormans expedition believe that what they have actually removed from the mountain is a meteorite. And that is what it's been sort of classified as, though we get a line here about the fact that the visitor, quote unquote, deceived them into classifying it as a meteorite. And then I do love the response of, your whole expedition got hypnotized by a rock? That's what you're expecting us to believe? And from here we learn that the Board of Inquiry is sort of overseeing the kind of cleanup operations of what happened, and that they are meeting within a museum. That's where they're sort of holding these hearings, and it is likely there because there is nowhere else to meet. We do also get an idea of just how much damage there is to the city. There's a line here that says, "From these turret windows, one might view some good-sized wedges of the city, here and there all the way to the horizon. Charred trees still quietly smoking, flanged steelwork fallen or leaning perilously, streets near the bridges and ferry slips jammed with the entangled carriages, wagons and streetcars which the population had at first tried to flee in, been abandoned, and which even now lay unclaimed, overturned, damaged by collision and fire, hitched to animals months dead, and yet unremoved." So things are in pretty dire straits. From there, Pynchon gives us a idea of kind of what the makeup of this board of inquiry is. What we end up sort of learning is that the members here are the appointees of a mayor that are a part of the museum's board of overseers, is essentially what they are. And they are not people in like big, as the book says, exalted institutions. They're just they're closer to just regular people that are staffing this board of inquiry. I do also love the line "tamanoid creatures," which is a reference to a very long and sordid history of New York politics that for quite a long time ran through this place called Tammany Hall, and this is where all sorts of real debaucherous parties happened, but it's also where a lot of corruption was kind of centralized in how people got jobs, in how departments were formed or shut down, how people advanced through the ranks of the sort of local government, all of that. And I've mentioned this book several times before, but if you go and read The Power Broker by Robert Caro, there's some brief information about Tammany Hall in there and how the sort of subject of that book, Robert Moses, was coming in towards the real tail end of any of that stuff being left, but still had to kind of navigate through what those structures maybe used to be it, a bit less potent than they were. It's a very interesting history that you can read about, but that's not sort of what we're looking at. We're looking at sort of low-level guys who are, again, more sort of down to earth, so to speak, or at least closer to the average sort of person living in New York than you would have in any of these sort of high and exalted institutions. And then we get some really great detail again about how all of these different people have fled. There was all these different organizations that came into the city to try. They've all left, other than the street sweepers. Those guys are still the only ones trying to kind of keep the city in order, so to speak. And then we get some great kind of angelic imagery with them being referred to as the White Wings, of course, responding to this kind of very heavily devil-coded incident that's occurred. And then we also get this really interesting paragraph. Does someone want to read the paragraph? That says sometimes the inquiry board beneath that whole description of what the inquiry board is.
Sometimes this inquiry board held night sessions, striding in the side entrance where the enfeebled and unprotected had learned to come and wait for as long as they must. The museum at night presented a vista of earthbound buttresses, unlighted and towering, secret doorways between bays, several miniature street-level beer gardens within, and remaining open until late. Through the kindness and wisdom of the precinct police, block after block of sloping masonry, a sooty yellow in this growing dark and distinct, as if printed out of register.
Yeah, I really like that quote, especially in context of exactly kind of what's left in the city. That, like, conceptually, a lot of this evil stuff is gone, right? The Tammany Hall crap, the National Guard is evacuated, and sort of all that's left, at least at this stage anyway, are some low level appointees that sort of oversee the board of inquiry, and then also like the street sweepers, which is the lowest of the low kind of municipal workers. But that people are still kind of flocking to that, and to have that kind of centralized in a museum, I think that's really great imagery from Pynchon there. Do we have any thoughts on the overseers board and any of this information from early in the chapter before we go on?
So I was taught about Tammany Hall, I think in college, I think we spent at least a week on it.
Mhm.
And I do have some things to add about that. I mean, just the phrase "able to deliver votes when required" is definitely an aspect of the whole Tammany Hall thing, where People in unions, people in charge of unions would sell, or maybe not sell, but be bribed into influencing their union members into voting a certain way. You would bribe somebody to make somebody's neighborhood vote a certain way because that person had some type of control over the people in the neighborhood, perhaps like a mob boss or different stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, I really like that. It is a really fun kind of reference, and the word tamanoid is obviously just really fun. That might be Pinchin might have come up with that himself. I'm not 100% on that. He may not have, but it's possible. That little section, a little half of a sentence, is really interesting. And I think compresses a lot of the history of New York City into just half sentence. So
Yeah, definitely. What strikes me the most about this, it's not anything new. It's a specific thing that both of y'all left out. This is not just any museum. This is the Museum of Museumology.
Yeah.
So this is a museum dedicated to the busy work of maintaining an archive, run by the people who, from like in like a corporate structure analogy, are essentially like the assistant managers of Subway of the New York political machine. This is like the most pedantic place in history.
Yeah. And it is kind of funny conceptually that in response to like city scale destruction, you have to go and talk to an inquiry board about it. Like that amidst the ruins, no less, too. Like there's definitely some humor in that to me as well. From there, we get a great quote here. This says, "The Eskimo believe that every object in their surroundings has its invisible ruler, in general not friendly, an enforcer of ancient, indeed pre-human laws, and thus a power that must be induced not to harm men through various forms of bribery." And then maybe my favorite joke in the whole set of two chapters says, "At mention of the time-honored practice, commissional ears were observed to develop sharp points and to tilt forward. It was thus not so much the visible object we sought and wished to deliver to the museum as its invisible ruling component. In the Eskimo view, someone of our party, by failing to perform the due observances, showed deep disrespect, causing the power to follow its nature in exacting an appropriate vengeance." This is an interesting kind of random like offer of explanation that I don't think is founded in any reality. I could be wrong about that, but this certainly to me feels like just they're trying to come up with an explanation rather than specifically what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I from my very very minimal understanding of northern tribes' beliefs, like it doesn't seem like it's coming out of exactly nowhere. But it is also pretty obvious that no one in the room has any reason to believe this.
Yeah, it's just sort of whatever description they can come up with for the inquiry board, and from there we are told that the level of destruction is appropriate because it is an appropriate response to urban civilization, so to speak. If all you've come from is places of bad ice, or it says blizzards and malevolent ghosts, then this is quite opposite of that. You would see fit to kind of level it. This is where we kind of get into a lot of descriptions of kind of what had happened that evening, but then also some more specific stuff does get brought up here. Like the phrase "panic fear" is used, but in reference to Pan, like the part of the Greek pantheon Pan. This is sort of referred to as wild or untamed fear. Then in that regard, if we're looking at it specifically through the lens of that particular deity. They also mentioned they had established a few facts that deep downtown, where a narrow waterway from long ago still ran up into the city, a cargo ship had arrived, in whose hold Captain Restraint's more hopeful than effective stirred a figure with supernatural powers. There is no canal that runs into New York. There used to be an actual canal, like on Canal Street, if you were in the city. But this is one of those anachronistic points of reference in these chapters where by the time this all would have happened in the late 1890s, that canal would have been completely covered over for some time at that point. It's unclear what specifically that is in reference to, but that is the most likely sort of culprit. And then eventually, at the it says instant of arrival, having willed itself up into the necessary temperature, it began methodical and unrelenting to burn its way out of its enclosure. Those who had chosen to stay aboard ship for as long as possible, one by one, as in a kind of moral exhaustion, let go, tumbled into flight up the ladders, out the hatches, away over the brow, down into the thoroughfares of the city. But with only dwindling moments of normal history remaining, where could any of them have found refuge in time? No escort of tenderloin toughs, no chamber of privilege. However, deep within the anchors of any of the great bridges, no train or water tunnel could have preserved even one of those impure refugees from what was to come. So it burns out of its enclosure, destroys the ship, and then people start to flee, but there is nowhere to flee. And we get this reference, but with only dwindling moments of normal history remaining, where could any of them have found refuge in time? I think that this is a particularly interesting passage for a couple of reasons, but it's what to me sums up a lot of the individual disparate components of the chapter that sort of we have pointed to. Specifically, the concept of bilocations, the concept of linear time, the appropriation of the creature for capitalist reasons or aims, 9/11, and then also the concept of circular time. So this is my crazy conspiracy corner sort of summation of everything for these two chapters, at least in my perspective. What's taking place in these two chapters is an unleashing of evil as the result of capitalistic expedition and enterprise, one that is also supported by the government. We know that these two things, capitalism and corporations and the government, are in league with one another because at the end of the previous chapter, we are given a description of how the US government has started classifying corporations as people, giving a reliability to companies to sort of depend on the US government to support their causes. And certainly, at least in that case, it sort of came out that way because they saved that railroad company, untold amounts of money. Now, linear time. It says that we're running out of normal history. And as we move closer to the unleashing of this capitalist evil, the industrialized world will break history into something altogether different by its arrival. It's also important to note that it involves the relocation of a creature that was held in by magic of the old world or inner earth, just as all sorts of native artifacts are relocated in museums. But with the idea of bilocations in mind, it tells us that two things can be happening in the same place or can be present in the same place at once. Or looking back to like Iceland Spar and all of these different concepts of nonlinear time that we've talked about in this chapter and the ones previous, that there are perhaps multiple sort of realities overlaid on one another, or that every event in time happens simultaneously if you're looking at a circular view, and it's just your point of reference that kind of shows you what it is that you're looking at. And so in this way, New York is destroyed as a result of the arrival of modernity and hypercapitalism and these sort of conglomerates that are kind of warned about in the previous chapter in that last conversation in the Explorers Club. But New York will also be destroyed again in the future for becoming a symbol of that very thing, becoming a symbol of the power of capitalism in the West and the imperial core by the hijacking of the planes and the flying of them into the Twin Towers. That event is also referred to as kind of the end of history, not just by myself during the Bleeding Edge episodes, but in many different books and kind of referential texts about that event in particular. And so history is ending not just in the sense that sort of the old world is gone, but also in the sense that when this kind of comes back around to look at it through either a overlaid perspective or a circular time perspective, it ends again once 9/11 happens to give birth to something else entirely. And there's the additional layer of irony, of course, that event was perpetrated by terrorists in the Eastern world who the United States government armed in the first place when they came into being. So those are kind of all of those different elements that I have noticed over these past couple chapters, put it together in that one sentence of this concept of the sort of end of time. And of course, this chapter ends with somebody kind of escaping into the future as a way of escaping into some level of safety. Do we have any thoughts on that, or what Pynchon is getting at when he's talking about the sort of end of normal history?
I think you're right to point to everything you did. I also think that it could be a reference to this is a point in the novel where things are going to get less realistic and more fantastical. Where, I mean, I guess everything with the Chums of Chance and their airship is obviously not historical, but a lot of the stuff that comes in between those sections, in between the Chums of Chance sections, is more based in history and more realistic, I guess. And I don't know. I mean, this is obviously kind of spoiler talk. I'm talking about the rest of the book, and I don't have that great of a handle on what's to come because it's been, like 10, 12 years since I've read this book in its entirety. That being said, there is some kind of more fantastical stuff to come. And I do feel like the narrative kind of increasingly moves away from depicting historical events realistically and truthfully. And I do think that is a growing thing throughout this book, a growing aspect of this book as you go through it. That's obviously a bit simplistic and not quite as interesting as what you were saying, but I do think that could be an aspect of what he's getting at.
Yeah, I mean, so I personally, I do think that Luke's onto something there. I'm not entirely sure that that's what's going on in the sentence, but I do think that's what's going on in this section of the book for sure. If we want to get like super reductive, well, normal time in the context of fleeing for your life is entering or exiting reality, right? To the end of normal time and the entrance into the eternal time goes. But then to flip and go the opposite direction, I I would I would say that rather than necessarily the end of history kind of interpretation that you refer to, Kate, I would say that like this point in time in a lot of ways, like in real history, was the kind of a point of convergence where everything had come together, and that humanity had traveled the globe in full. Like they might not have reached the North Pole on this expedition, and it might not have been a couple of years before a real person did reach the pole or whatever in a documented sense. But like Luke said previously, someone probably got there at some point before us, and even if not, we firmly knew what was there long before anyone made it to the pole. But what it does is it, you have Fleetwood vibe, the son of this industrial magnate, going out to confirm the suspicions, basically, and coming back and bringing back, sure, just a meteorite, but a meteorite that is also this incredible horror. And it just, I think it may not be necessarily the end or the beginning of anything, but simply this moment of transference into something new, transmutation, I guess. And the reason I really mention that is that, like, even if this is set in 1898, it's clearly like the only year that's actually given is 1899, and 1899 is the year that like Goddard theorized about rockets for the first time, and it was the year that in the Boer War, British first used indirect lines of fire, which happened after Goddard theorized about using rockets. And it was 1899 was the year that Ford started the Detroit Automobile Company, which would fail, but taught him how to do Ford. And 1899 was unrelated to Ford, the first year that anyone died in a gasoline powered automobile accident.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like I did a lot of dredging through the history of this time span to kind of try and nail down what this visitor is, and I don't have an answer, but it is this shape of thing.
Sure. If we don't have any other thoughts on that specifically, we can move forward here with some other sort of uh, consequences of its arrival. The electric power fails just at the peak of evening rush hour. Gas mains begin to ignite. Cobblestones erupt skyward. Fire alarms would go unanswered, and people just sort of start to go crazy. Like a hysteria settles in. People start trying to escape. People start running in random directions. Military leaves are canceled. It specifically says. I also love opera performances cut in half. Arias, even famous ones, omitted altogether to allow for missile. The concept that like Armageddon would be happening, but they still want to finish an opera performance, not just like cancel it entirely or just like cut it immediately is a quite a funny idea to me. And then we have this other line here that I wanted to ask you guys about. Tenderloin alleyways rudely interrupted and usually at critical moments. Fear among the populace of twilight hours too abruptly extended of indistinct faces, high windows, and what might, for the first time in civic memory, plausibly enter there. There is an interpretation, if you are looking at this dual sort of idea that I kind of articulated between the arrival of modernity and then also 9/11, that you could make that what they're thinking about entering through the window would be a plane, right? And then you can extrapolate that to 9/11. Is it that there is a physical creature roaming around that for the first time they've seen something tall enough that like it could enter in a window at that height? I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on what that line might be referring to.
For me, it makes me think of like, I mean, and this is not in the text at all. Besides the figures in high windows, it's just like snipers in high windows. I don't know where I'm really getting that from, or
Hmm.
that's just off the top of my head. Even when I was reading it, it made me think of that of like people like like there being mass confusion and people appearing in some window and shooting at the people and stuff, like a mass shooting. But that's not really in the text at all. That's just what it makes me think of. What it made me think of when I was reading it. Also, to go back to the whole opera being interrupted and stuff, that does remind me of the ending of Gravity's Rainbow, where there's a movie being shown, and it is, in my interpretation, a lot of people's interpretation, interrupted by a rocket falling on the theater. I
Right.
do think that there are there's a relationship there between those details and Against the Day, and then the ending of Gravity's Rainbow.
And also 9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm just gonna read out loud the last line. Here among the populous twilight hours too abruptly extended, of indistinct faces, of high windows, and what might, for the first time in civic memory, plausibly enter there. So I again, like I just mentioned, I do take the end of Gravity's Rainbow as a bit of a prefiguration of 9/11, and in that sense, I would say that this also is. I do think, in a grammatical sense, it is. It is. I don't know. It feels like it is. It is. I don't. It doesn't quite feel like that's what it's saying to me. That it's alluding to a
Yeah,
plane
but
hitting.
I can't make heads or tails of what it's pointing to. It's a really interesting sentence.
Yeah. So like, there are visitors unnamed or just abnormal things which may enter the high window. And I think there's a reading of it being as simple as people who live in high rises never have to worry about what might come through their windows, even though
Hmm.
obviously they should. It might be more of a comment on the attitude of urban dweller.
Right.
I mean, it did just occur to me that it could be kind of veiled reference to people jumping off the World Trade Center, like the top of it, whenever like the plane hit below them, like people, like falling from the sky, people jumping from windows, falling from the sky, and that'd be the first time in civic memory that would have happened or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Is it the fear that's too abruptly extended? Is it the twilight hours that are too abruptly extended?
I think it's the twilight hours. So that's what I read it as.
Or I mean, I
Yeah.
think it might be both actually. Like,
Yeah, it's really the line first time in civic memory plausibly enter there. Like that's the part, like entering the windows. Okay, what is that? So yeah, I mean, if you're a listener who has a well developed theory, with this is of course we invite you to write into us.
yeah, this is really. Thank you for throwing me this puzzle that I hadn't seen before,
Yeah,
because
you're
there are like 3 different ways of joining these clauses that he uses, and they're
Mhm.
partially nested and partially unnested.
Yeah.
Just hadn't I had just not made the connection all the way through.
When I read this through for preparing for the show, like I went back and read through the sentence like several times, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, is it entering the city? Is it entering is it entering the city, like the city in a figurative sense, or like the society? Is it entering the alleyways of the Tenderloin? Is it entering the twilight? Is it entering the windows? Like, I think you could argue that that enter applies to all of those nouns.
Yeah. Yeah, I have mostly interpreted as entering the windows, but like you're saying, it could easily be several of those. It's an interesting one. So yeah, write in if you have any ideas. And if you manage to square that circle, Will, you'll have to articulate it on a later episode of the show.
See what happens.
We do get a nice aside. There was a debate about what happened to the mayor, and that his face started appearing on like billboards and the back of milk cartons and all of the classic spots for something like that to happen. And it's really it's just a funny like piece of detail that he doesn't need to include here necessarily to make to make the chapter work, but does. And it's those bits that make Pinchon so enjoyable to read to me, at least in part. And at this point, we get more details about how like the electric grid isn't working as well as it used to, and there's sort of this chorus of pain, which is also just terrifying to think of. Which of course does if you are kind of looking at this from that dual lens of 9/11 and sort of the beginning of modernism, could refer to just how much like noise of the screaming and of the absolute pain that the people sort of near ground zero would have been going through. But just to kind of think about what that would sound like to have a group of people all experience enough pain to scream out for rescue or help, just what that would sound like as a chorus. It's again really effective horror writing, and especially with how he follows it up. It says a choral of pain just about to pass from its realm of the invisible into something that might actually have to be dealt with. Figures which late at night appeared only in levels of gray were now seen to possess color, not the fashionable shades of daytime, but blood reds, morgue yellows, and poison green. It's just it's really, really effective writing. And this leads us into the discussion of the three-dimensional image in full color, not exactly of Christ, but with the same beard, robes, and ability to emit light. As if, should the worst happen, they could deny all out Christian allegiance, and so make that much easier whatever turnings of heart might become necessary in striking a deal with the invader. Each night at dusk, the luminous declaration was tested for electrical continuity, power level, accuracy of colors, and so on. Fair lamps were kept ready for the possibility haunted everyone that the projection device might fail at a critical moment. No one would venture at night into the neighborhood of unknown vampires without carrying along a cross, the Archbishop had declared. Would they now? No. And so with this, our protector, who remained guardedly unnamed. So, what do we think of this section? I have a theory, but I'd like to know what you guys think of it as well.
For once, my thoughts are short. I think it's
Okay.
I think it's the arch the archdiocese saying, "Hey, focus on God rather than the pain around you."
Yeah, I think you're broadly correct on that interpretation from why you'd be doing it. I don't know if this is exactly the figure of light, so to speak, that he's referring to. I don't think it's that literal. I think that maybe the entity is referring to something more like a Jesus figure. If he is sort of this amalgam of all the things that kind of point towards a serpent or a Satan, then the figure of light would be its opposite, which I guess would be a very Zoroastrian sort of understanding. But I think the other thing that is interesting is again going to briefly mention that if you're looking at these with these parallel understandings with 9/11, there was a huge run on religion, so to speak, is what I'll say. Right after that event happened, churches were filled. People were briefly very, very interested in what preachers and what the Bible would have to say about the situation as a way to kind of explain the chaos and the carnage that they were living in. This, of course, dissipated pretty soon after that. But I think another interpretation that, at least to me, also merits kind of discussion is the way in which the figure isn't exactly Jesus and is also kind of unnamed, and how that could, if we're looking at it from what the entity says about it not being able to save them, could be the very thing that points towards their destruction. So, like, if we're going to zoom out and look at what this would mean, like if the destroyer is Satan and if the figure is supposed to be Jesus, what does it mean if it's not Jesus? Okay. So speaking in my ministerial tone, your object of salvation or your object of faith and hope is supposed to be Christ. That's what you're supposed to put your faith in, and he is an extension of Yahweh, or the sort of God the Father. And we know a couple of things about him. One is that you shouldn't say his name, but another and more important one is that you are not supposed to have any other gods before him. And a third is that you're not supposed to make graven images, not just of him, but of anything. You're not supposed to have idols. And so, what they're doing here, if we were to look through it in this lens of trying to search for salvation, is basically invalidating their own religion either way. So if the hologram is God, then that's a problem because you're making graven images and you're also, potentially taking his name in vain based upon what you may call it. And the passage indicates that it being unnamed and it being kind of blurred is to give them some plausible deniability about what it is in an effort to strike a bargain with the entity. Or you're also damned if it's not God, because if it's not him, then Yahweh specifically, then you are having another God before him that you're hoping is going to save you from the vampires in the neighborhood, or the entity that is destroying the city. And so I think that there is an additional sort of extrapolation out of that you could make, in the sense that when we have kind of moved into the modern, that modernity has kind of taken hold, and the old world of sort of magic and sort of the inherent like Edenic nature of the land and the inherent holiness of sort of a raw landscape and a pre-modern society is gone, then you kind of lose the purpose for spiritual images and they lose their power. But in times of great crisis, people still try to turn to them anyway. Kind of looking at a sort of we have killed God sense, but still have a need to replace him. And in doing that, it's, if you're looking at this through like a biblical theology perspective, you are doing so without a pure heart. You're doing so from a like opportunistic perspective. It doesn't represent any kind of genuine conversion or metanoia, if we're going to go Greek with the words that we're using to describe that process. There's no atonement there, and so therefore it's invalid. Those symbols and those things that you're trying to draw on to save you can't anymore because you have robbed them of the meaning that they have by your engagement with them in this context or in this cultural milieu. So that's kind of my long extended thoughts that I had from the perspective of the fact that we have, a lot of other sort of religious things going on in these two chapters, religious allusions being made, and then also what it's pretty clear the entity is meant to metaphorically represent.
That all makes sense to me. I would like to say just something that strengthens your point. The moment where it talks about the necessary turning.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's. I think that you pretty much followed all that out, except for the vampire bit, which pretty
Well, for that, you
suspect.
should just go watch Midnight Mass.
It's a good show. I've seen it like 2 or 3 times.
It's real. It might be the best thing Netflix has ever financed, actually.
You might be right about that. Yeah.
But from there, we get a mention of sort of how the outer boroughs are dealing with this issue, that this mainly seems to be a sort of Manhattan-centered problem, and that, it would be a while before this kind of expansion of the city and expansion of thus the kind of chaos of the city takes to get to those outer boroughs. This does reflect some real history that I don't know if maybe there's anything from your experience in school reading about Tammany Hall that would inform that, Luke, but the way that the outer boroughs in New York are governed is kind of semi-autonomously, but semi-collectively in the sense that they have like a borough authority for each of them that governs borough-specific issues, but then they also lend sort of support and votes to issues going on in New York City as a whole, and that they have the option to sort of join or not join the city as time went on. But as the city itself expanded, it was pretty hard to deny it. And really, only one portion of Queens, I think, voted to not join, which became Nassau County, if I remember correctly. So we have some additional sort of real life kind of illusions going on there, and then we get the additional kind of extrapolation of that the city had become a material expression of a particular loss of innocence, not sexual or political innocence, but somehow a shared dream of what a city might at its best prove to be. Its inhabitants became and have remained an embittered and amnesiac race, wounded but unable to connect through the memory to the moment of the injury, unable to summon the face of their violator, which I think is just really, really great poetic language that he uses to describe kind of the psychic wound on a city, which does, of course, then, if you're looking at this through the dual analysis perspective, carry over as well to 9/11.
This is when I come clean and say the first time I read this section, I went 100% through this all these chapters. Thought that this was in San Francisco.
Oh, really?
Which makes it way weirder, but also kind of holds up. And I do suspect that a lot of this was written to be as generic as possible. Which I don't say to cast doubt on what you're extending, because it's there, obviously.
Yeah.
But
I
it
also think
is just
it's
interesting.
just true generally as well.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And then we get another really great follow-up to that exact same concept, that instead of kind of developing this sort of unified kindness or this like sort of desire to kind of help and uplift one another and kind of push towards recovery and just sort of healing, that instead of that, the city becomes sort of hell, and there's a great amount of anger that comes out of that. And Pynchon really looks at this through a pretty abstract lens where the city is a woman and the invading force is a man, and this played out as essentially a rape metaphorically, and how that violation then turns out against everything else in the world instead of focusing again on like a recovery or a healing of something like that, or something from that rather. And again, looking at it through a dual analysis perspective, you could then extrapolate that out to be that instead of like looking at why 9/11 happened and what the purpose of destroying the Twin Towers or attacking the United States may have meant from a terrorist's perspective, and to kind of look at yourself hard in the mirror as a result of that, instead we became ultra militaristic and doubled down on the sort of imperialism and invaded two countries, and there was a whole brouhaha that carried over in country music and sort of nationalistic principles and concepts really got pushed to the forefront as a result of that, which is really a tragedy. And that isn't, of course, to say that like we should look at terrorist attacks as an opportunity to improve ourselves, but rather that there is the reality that like terrorists do something for a political reason. Like the definition of terrorism is, violence being used for political ends. And so, what would that political reason have been? So that again is another way to look at this through that lens of dual interpretation. But even without that removed, if we are just looking at this from a perspective of what happened, it is an incredibly stirring sort of description of what the city is becoming or changing into as a result of what has happened. But
Here I was thinking that when you introduced 9/11 layer, you were going to say that the collapse of its economic penis. End of sentence.
Yeah, and then we built an even larger one afterwards.
an even more phallic one.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
We love
And then
America.
again, yeah, absolutely true. And then we get a further sort of follow up of the recovery of this. There's a reference to Dante, the line "I am the way into the doleful city" is used as kind of an entryway point to the city, or a way to commemorate the kind of ground zero of what occurred. For people who have not read Dante or who have not read it in a while or aren't familiar, this is the beginning of the inscription on the door to hell that ends with the pretty famous line, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." But there is an interesting description within this paragraph too, where it says, "So in hopes of being spared further suffering as demonstrations of loyalty to the destroyer, in the spirit of the votive shrine, the city had put up a number of proprietary structures. Many of these were deliberately burned, attempts being made to blacken the stylized wreckage in aesthetic and interesting ways. Attention was directed downtown, kept wrapped in a plasma of protective ignorance, extending at last to the enormous rampart of silence along its edge, one limit of the known world beyond which lay a realm the rest of the city could not speak of." This is an example of sort of, again, if you're looking at this through that dual interpretation perspective, this could be seen as a descriptor of, if you go to Ground Zero in real life, there's a monument there that is basically just two holes in the ground that represent the footprint of the towers and where they used to stand, basically. And it if I remember correctly, there's an eternal waterfall that runs over the edge of that, and over and over and over again. And so there are some people who can kind of take those sentences and apply that to what that monument looks like now. But either way, the city is kind of finding a way to memorialize what happened, but also in a way that kind of pays fealty or homage to the destroyer in the first place by constantly keeping its presence there. That rather than moving past it, we've chosen to kind of venerate the site of destruction, so to speak. And then finally, that leads us to the close of this chapter with Hunter Penhallow. I think you're right, Luke. I think he's not a character we've seen before. Do you know for sure, Will?
Yeah, so he was in. So, okay, basically, going back to my structural analysis, these 3 chapters are a triptych where you have the central first-person scene of Fleetwood Vibe narrating the event of discovery, prefaced and ended with an extremely non-linear, extremely non-situated passages of poetry that look at every perspective except for the one of this inheritor of what is to come.
Mm-hmm.
And Hunter was the way in and out of this little triptych. He was the
Gotcha.
one who descended from left his grandmother and I.
Oh, sure. Yep. We read that so long ago that I forgot his name.
Yup.
Yes. So Hunter Penhallow is on his way out of town, and he gets lost. Suddenly, the streets don't make any sense. They don't match the grid that he understood in his mind. There's also fog now that has filled the city, and so he finds himself walking through a sort of, quote, monumental gateway, unaccountably more ancient and foreign than anything in the known city. Streets had by now grown intimate, more like corridors. Without intending to, he soon was walking through inhabited rooms. At one end of a mostly empty hallway, he found a meeting in progress. People were sitting clustered about a fireplace with cups and glasses, ashtrays, and spittoons. But the occasion was more than social. Both the men and women had kept their coats and hats on. Hunter approached tentatively. And at this point, he is invited to come with those people to escape the city. And the group of them get on what appears to be a subway train, from what I can tell, based on its description. And the vehicle moves. It goes underground, as subway stations tend to do, or subway trains tend to do. And then it slowly moves into the future. Suddenly, the buildings look more futuristic. The longer he's on the train, and it closes with the lines, Hunter was on his way to refute whatever that might have come to mean anymore in this world brought low. What do we think of Hunter's escape from New York?
I think it's especially interesting that it gets more and more futuristic the further out it gets.
Agreed.
My own experience with riding in trains in cities, it's often the opposite, where if you're leaving from like the center of downtown and going outwards, the buildings are going to get older and just generally not as shiny and new. So that's definitely kind of an inversion of what you would expect.
A screaming comes across the sky, is what I think of it. I cannot read this as anything other than Hunter being on that train that opens Gravity's Rainbow. Because it's just so much. It feels, and maybe if I went back and compared them side by side, they wouldn't feel so one-to-one, but it does feel one-to-one in terms of like the experience of like this weird, ambiguous urban train.
Yeah. One that doesn't exist yet as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, there's the possibility that he like is actually traveling into the future, and that there is a feeling of safety that may come with that. But of course, if you're extrapolating out these ideas of sort of modernity and the new world order arriving, there isn't more safety in the future. It just kind of keeps accelerating, but maybe there's a perceived safety because it's the social norm at that point. Maybe he is traveling so far into the future that it is like genuinely utopic. It's a very interesting passage that I am hoping there is follow up on in the book, given that there's still like 900 pages left. But it prompts a lot of questions, certainly. Do we have any other thoughts on this chapter or the two chapters as a whole before we wrap up? That closes out our discussion of chapters 12 and 13 of Against the Day. Thank you guys for hanging out with us while we kind of got back on track with the schedule. I promise that we are going to hopefully be pretty much back to normal from sort of this way out. But of course, before we finish the episode as a whole, we do still have our other categories to go through. Were there any funny moments that anyone had that we didn't cover as a result of covering the two chapters?
Not a very funny set of chapters.
Not particularly. So what do we think the most pinch on part of the chapter is?
For me, it's the part in the Explorers Club where the explorer, is going on about another form of life deciding to use humans like humans use dogs and stuff. I've commented on this a good amount over the course of the podcast about Pynchon using genre type ideas or like science fiction or fantasy kind of ideas and framing them in a more literary way or using kind of stealing from that genre and adding it to literary fiction. And that is a bit of an overlooked aspect of his work, and that's probably the most mentioned part of the chapter for me just because of that.
That's a good shout.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it's what I had already articulated earlier in the episode. It is that union of so many different elements that we had already kind of talked about, and the way that he blends all of those together in such a cohesive manner. It's hard to do, and it's hard to do in a way that it doesn't feel like the writer is just talking directly to you. And even though he is a bit more clear about what his endeavor is or his point is across these two chapters, it still doesn't necessarily feel like you're being lectured to, or that the author is just directly telling you this is what you're supposed to think. And so the fact that he's able to do that, well, it also contains such a literary quality from a perspective of, you know, these two monologues that are so similar to one another, the inherent implications of those two monologues, and then the way that he personifies a city, and the way that he personifies that like psychic pain or psychic shared trauma that can happen collectively in times of great sort of tragedy or stress. It's just very, very impressive that he's able to pull all of those off so cleanly, and that really strikes me as being the most pinch on part of the chapter, which I guess is more or less just saying the whole chapters are, which maybe is a bit of a cop out, but the amount of work that he's doing to juggle all those different elements is really quite something.
Yeah, at least in my book, it's not a cop out. Y'all have let me get away with it too many times. But my most pinching part gonna be the sturdy young pals of the pole. And just that song is like it's old school Pynchon songs where he clearly knew a couple of jazz standards and like school and national anthems and was just writing everything to the same tune. But at least this time it's in line with what people were actually singing.
Yeah, that is a rare case of a Pynchon song that I do not hate.
You don't hate it?
I don't.
Are you sure it's not just poisoning your point?
It's possible. We've been doing this show for almost 3 years, which is pretty crazy to think about. But maybe just repeated exposure is all that I needed. All right, so that brings us to quotes. Is there anyone who wants to kick us off specifically?
So mine is on page 142. It's near the top. Scholars of the Eddas, recently having perused them in original form in the Library of Iceland, were to suggest later, too late, comparison to Buri, grandfather of Odin and the first gods, frozen in the ice of Niflheim for uncounted ages, who being licked awake by the tongue of the mythic cow Adumla. Which of us then, mindlessly as children at a fairground, had not performed the analogous service for our own frozen visitant? What gods, what races, what worlds were about to be born? This is a very interesting paragraph. There's a lot going on. It does showcase the kind of like a first person perspective in a way that some other parts of that chapter don't. Where there's a good amount of that chapter that I feel like just the regular book narrator could have written, but that particular section is a little bit more in like Fleetwood's vernacular, I guess.
My quote comes from page 151, where it says, "It had become quite unpleasant that night. This city, even on the best of days, had always been known for its background rumble of anxiety. Anyone who wittingly dwelt here gambled daily that whatever was to happen would proceed slowly enough to allow at least one consultation with somebody, that there would always be time, as Citizen liked to put it. But that courtless nightfall, events were moving too fast even to take in. Forget about examine or analyze, or in fact do much of anything but run from, and hope you could avoid getting killed. That's about as closely as anybody was thinking it through. Everyone in town, most inconveniently at the same time, suffering that panic fear. Down the years of boom and corruption, they'd been warned repeatedly about just such a possibility. The city more and more vertical, the population growing in density, all hostages to just such an incursion. Who outside the city would have imagined them as victims taken by surprise? Who, for that matter, inside it, though many in the aftermath did profit briefly by assuming just that affecting prose. It was really tough for me to pick a quote for this episode because there's a lot of really good options, but that is one of the ones that really sells the kind of psychic panic or psychic fear or pain that Pynchon is writing a lot about in this set of chapters, and that when you are kind of huddled really closely together in a New York or a San Francisco or whatever, there is sort of this overarching like energy that pervades everything, and it is kind of, hard to get away from. And when something dire happens or when something really, really horrific happens, it does kind of infect everything. And the way that he writes about that happening, kind of starting in this chapter, showcases how that proximity and that sort of modern convenience of living in a city, or that kind of like beauty of living in a city, quote unquote, can very quickly turn to ruin very, very fast. And how these kind of symbols of sort of modern living or advanced sort of modernity can very, very quickly turn into something that is exactly the opposite. And of course, that has a grand tradition in history of cities being burned, or tragedies taking place in cities, or things going wrong within cities, and how that is something that does unite it with the rest of history, even if this particular one is being motivated by a completely different animating force. So it's just one of those things that, like, I think really showcases what Pynchon's interested in writing about in these chapters, but also is very, very effective and just prompted a lot of thought in me as well of where this may exist within history, or within history of tragedy, maybe specifically.
I mean, yeah, I think great way to look at that passage. My favorite is gonna have to be on 144. Bringing what we had recovered back to the ship proved to be only the first of our trials. Stowing the object in the hold was cursed from the beginning. One failure followed another. Purchase did not give way. Then some hawser, regardless of size, was sure to strand. Yet each time, mysteriously, the object was rescued from falling to possible destruction, as if it were somehow meant to survive our worst effort. Trying to get it fit inside the ship, we measured and remeasured, and each time the dimensions kept coming out different, not just slightly, but drastically. There seemed no way to get the object through any of the ship's hatches. We had finally to resort to our cutting tool. All the while, the thing regarded us what later, when we had begun to appreciate the range of emotions, we might too easily have recognized as contempt. With its eyes set closely side by side like those of humans and other binocular predators, its gaze had remained directed solely, personally, to each of us, no matter where we stood or moved. And that one, I just do love the sense of burgeoning understanding that is laden through it.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right that like burgeoning understanding in particular is really sold in that paragraph in a way that is really, really effective in context of like all of the warnings prior to that.
Yeah.
Of the just sort of mounting feeling in the reader that like no, don't do this. Like whatever this is, don't do it.
Yeah, I mean it's staring you down.
Yep. So thank you for listening to our discussions on chapters 12 and 13. And again, I can't thank the audience enough for sticking with us through the break. Next episode, we'll be covering chapters 14 and 15. If you are reading with the pretty standard pagination that we have been following, that is going to lead you to page 188 is where we're going to end. And if you happen to have the UK edition that has a different pagination, the last line that you will read for that is, "Yes, Lewis, wherever could you have been living before that frightful bomb brought you to us?" And I believe, barring any unforeseen circumstances, coming up. We should be a complete company next episode as well with all 4 of us. So thank you again for listening. You can get in contact with us in any number of ways. We are on Blue Sky Mapping the Zone. We are on Twitter, albeit in a reduced capacity at Mapping the Zone Pod. You can also email us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We are on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Pod. And if you think our show is worth $1, we would love to have it. You can find us on Ko-Fi for any donations that you may wish to send our way. We thank everybody who has been able to donate to us so far. That has been able to purchase me a new microphone and a new recording setup. That has been able to purchase Luke a new microphone as well after the previous one was unfortunately stolen. That has allowed us to pay for our hosting costs so that all of you guys get access to the entirety of the episodes rather than just a section of them that we would be able to post for free using our RSS feed. And it will continue to pay for many more advances in our show in the future. And we thank every single one of you who has been so generous enough to donate. You can find us on Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone as well. And yeah, if you want terribly fitting t-shirts, because we're still working out that whole thing, or if you want some stickers, you can find us as well on Spreadshirt. We are there at Mapping the Zone as well. And until next time, thank you all for listening. I guess I'm just going to say that like 100 times this episode. Bye.
Bye.